Van Halen may be one of the most influential rock bands ever, but it's the group's behind-the-scenes antics that have made for the wildest headlines. Van Halen had only been a group for a few years, gigging around the Los Angeles area, when they got one of their earliest and potentially biggest breaks in 1976. Major British hard rock group UFO asked Van Halen to open for them in a show at the Golden West Ballroom, a venue in Norwalk, California. Van Halen performed well, but things took a dark turn after the concert for lead guitarist Eddie Van Halen. After he came off stage, a drug dealer offered the guitarist some cocaine, which he immediately ingested. Not 10 minutes later, drummer Alex Van Halen found his brother just as he passed out and began seizing. Eddie was taken to a hospital where the band members learned that he'd actually been given PCP, or angel dust, a powerful hallucinogenic drug. While receiving emergency medical care, Eddie briefly flatlined before doctors were able to get his heart beating again, saving the young musician's life. Throughout the 70s and into the 1980s, Van Halen loved to party with female fans, but one night with a camcorder resulted in an accidental and very scandalous sex tape.
It's fun.
Yeah.
You know?
You seem to have a good time.
The tape made its way to one of the band's managers, Marshall Burl, who showed it to members of Van Halen's label, Warner Brothers Records. The musicians got word and became irate, and they decided to take their revenge. With another manager, Noel Monk, members of Van Halen busted into Burl's business office in Hollywood. Then they systematically removed anything and everything with a Van Halen mention or connection. That included RIAA gold discs the band had gifted Burl, along with various memorabilia and merchandise. In 1983, Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak attempted a modern-day Woodstock, where Van Halen performed. The gig arrived after 3 months of touring, and the heavy drug use that went with it. Before the set, lead singer David Lee Roth spoke with MTV's Mark Goodman. Goodman later said of the encounter, he was drunk and coked up, laughing at every joke he made. After putting it off for 3 hours, Van Halen finally took the stage, but Roth could hardly perform. Wozniak wrote in his memoir, I Was, Computer Geek to Cult Icon, that Roth was so smashed he could hardly stand up, adding, he was so drunk, slurring and forgetting lyrics and everything. Destroying hotel rooms became a matter of course for Van Halen as part of the rock star lifestyle. After their very first out-of-state headline show, the band got in a fire extinguisher fight at the Madison Sheraton Hotel in Wisconsin, tore apart their individual rooms' furniture, and taped fish to multiple ceilings, according to Paul Brannigan's Unchained, the Eddie Van Halen story. And it wasn't just U.S. hotel rooms that got destroyed. In 1978, their bad behavior got them kicked out of Scotland. That year, Van Halen's first self-titled studio album received gold status from the Recording Industry Association of America. The members were on tour in Scotland when they learned of their achievement, and to celebrate, they got drunk off scotch and then used shoe polish to write the Van Halen logo on hotel walls. The next day, the rock stars were evicted from their hotel rooms and forced to leave Scotland. In 1984, MTV held a contest, and the prize was a weekend with Van Halen. The winner was 20-year-old Kurt Jeffries of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, who brought along his 19-year-old friend Tom Winnick. Giveaway promos promised a wild party.
You'll have no idea where you're going, and probably no memory of it after you go.
Van Halen delivered. Jeffries and his friend were flown in a private jet to Detroit, where they stayed in a hotel room filled with Van Halen merchandise, some of it X-rated. They then went to Van Halen's dressing rooms at the Cobo Arena and met Eddie Van Halen, whose wife, Valerie Bertinelli, gave the underage contest winners cocktails and shots. In 2020, Winnick told Vulture, "We were not without a drink for the rest of the time." After watching the concert from prime seats, Jeffries got pulled on stage to drink whiskey, get sprayed with champagne, and have his face dunked in a sheet cake. After MTV's camera crew left, the real partying backstage began. Jeffries and Winnick enjoyed steak, lobster, marijuana, a tremendous amount of alcohol, cocaine inhaled off of David Lee Roth's fingernail, and the attention of a very welcoming Van Halen groupie.
I loved it. I freaking loved it, man. That was awesome.
The second day, not much happened, as Roth was sick and needed medical attention. Jeffries was so hungover he had to pretend to drink the malt liquor foisted upon him by Alex Van Halen. The weekend culminated in a dressing room food fight. In the 1980s, when Van Halen was at its commercial peak, its relentless touring schedule took it to Seattle. While in town, the group made an unannounced visit to KISW, a rock radio station that frequently played its records. Former KISW disc jockey Bo Phillips told the Houston Press in 2014, "It was just an entourage of people following them in, and all of a sudden, clothes start coming off and women start grinding and the music goes up." Van Halen's antics eventually made it onto the airwaves. Members of the band took over the studio for about 3 hours. Phillips recalled, "David Lee Roth is getting more and more provocative on the phone as people are calling in. I was worried that the FCC was going to make a surprise visit, and there was cake all over the floor."
When the party was over, the entire control room was soaked with champagne.
In 1996, Van Halen was a surprise presenter at the MTV Video Music Awards, but at the mic was the band's original frontman, David Lee Roth, rather than its lead singer of the past decade, Sammy Hagar. After Hagar refused to record new songs for the Twister soundtrack, Roth stepped back in temporarily as Van Halen's vocalist. At the MTV event, Roth assumed his role as the band's spokesperson and quickly went off script. In front of a visibly irritated Eddie Van Halen, Roth joked around, saying, "It used to be, I want my MTV, and now it's like, give me your MTV or I'll blow your head off, man." This might have felt like a true reunion, but it wasn't. Eddie Van Halen told MTV that he felt Roth's behavior was embarrassing and disrespectful. He also said that Roth grew annoyed when Van Halen explained that not only did he have an upcoming hip surgery, but that all the band needed Roth for was a couple of songs on a greatest hits album and their videos. He goes, "Tonight's about me, man, and not your hip." The two nearly came to blows until a member of the band's staff got in the way. Van Halen started to force out founding bassist Michael Anthony in the late 1990s. His contributions were scarce on the 1998 album Van Halen 3, and his participation in a 2004 summer reunion almost didn't happen. Anthony told Byrne, "Ed really didn't want me to be a part of it." He negotiated a deal with the band's management for less money than that received by other members of Van Halen. Anthony believes that the nastiness directed at him and former Van Halen singer Sammy Hagar stemmed from things they did off stage. Hagar opened a nightclub and a tequila brand, both called Cabo Wabo, named after a 1988 Van Halen song. Anthony told New York Magazine, "I think the club rubbed Eddie and his brother Alex the wrong way."
The 10th year in Van Halen, it just went sideways.
Anthony stayed friends with Hagar after Hagar left the band. He also produced a brand of hot sauce, Mad Anthony's Hot Sauce. He said that the Van Halens didn't like that either. Finally, in 2006, Eddie Van Halen fired Anthony and hired a replacement on bass guitar, his then 15-year-old son, Wolfgang Van Halen. After leaving the band in 1996, Sammy Hagar returned 8 years later for a blockbuster reunion tour, but he still had bad blood with Eddie Van Halen, and the tour bombed. Speaking in an interview with music journalist Sally Steele, Hagar said, "What happened on that reunion tour in 2004 was some of the most miserable, backstabbing, dark crap I've ever been involved with in my whole life."
But I would never go through that again with anybody for any amount of money or any amount of fame and fortune or nothing.
Hagar tried to quit the tour entirely after 40 shows, but he ultimately didn't, fearing he'd be sued if he breached his contract. The months-long jaunt finished in Tucson, Arizona in November 2004. Hagar wrote in his memoir, Red, "It was the worst show we'd ever done in our lives. Eddie played so bad." The tour came to an explosive end when Van Halen melted down on stage. Eddie reportedly stopped playing in the middle of a song to smash his instrument, tearfully yelling to the audience, quote, "You don't understand." Van Halen didn't play in the mid-2000s, but Eddie Van Halen collaborated with other prominent musicians. At around that time, according to Andrew Bennett's Eruption in the Canyon, 212 Days and Nights with the Genius of Eddie Van Halen, he met up with Limp Bizkit frontman Fred Durst. They got together at Durst's home in Beverly Hills, and not surprisingly, the jam session became a party. When someone started smoking marijuana, it bothered Van Halen so much that he rushed out, leaving his equipment behind. The next day, Van Halen tried to arrange a time to grab his stuff, but Durst didn't answer his calls. Durst's silence pushed Van Halen over the edge. Van Halen had recently purchased a tank at an auction, and he drove it to Durst's home. When Durst opened the front door, he was greeted by Van Halen, who pointed a gun at his face. An employee of Durst quickly gathered all of Van Halen's tech while the guitarist smoked a cigarette, keeping his gun trained at Durst. In 2004, Eddie Van Halen decided that he wanted to chronicle his creative process, so he hired music photographer and filmmaker Andrew Bennett to be his personal documentarian. Bennett at times recorded Van Halen 24 hours a day and even lived in the guitarist's home in 2006 and 2007. Despite all this time with Van Halen, Bennett never produced a documentary. Instead, Bennett self-published Eruption in the Canyon, a photo-rich memoir of the period. It wasn't a positive portrayal either. It covered Van Halen's many binge-drinking incidents, as well as a time that the guitarist held a gun to Bennett's head for 30 minutes. Van Halen reportedly never paid Bennett a promised $250,000, and so in addition to the book, the chronicler uploaded some of his video footage to the internet. Van Halen filed legal paperwork to get a judge to prevent the release of any more material, claiming ownership of anything Bennett shot. In 2020, Bennett told Billboard, "I'm more confused, disappointed, and hurt than angry. Ed gave me his word. He saw how hard I worked, and then he f***ed me over. That's what shocks me. That's not the person I know."